When you hear the word slavery, what comes to mind? Well, chances are, if you're like most people, you think of African slaves in the U.S., African slaves in Egypt, and Africans enslaving each other, and that's about all. It's pretty interesting that when people think of slaves, they often equate the word with Africans. As a matter of fact, slavery has been around for thousands of years and has taken on many different forms. From early tribal conquests in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas to indentured servants in the early days of the U.S., slavery has taken many different forms and has touched practically every race on the planet. Slavery is a complex issue that is as varied as the civilizations that practice it. It's also an issue filled with misconceptions, confusion, and lies. For instance, did you know that the first slaves brought to America were white, not black? Did you know that Europe has a long tradition of slavery, which is where the former Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia derive the Slav part of their names? This program is all about slavery, the history of slavery, the variety of slavery, and the reasons for slavery. We'll start with an exploration of the reasons behind slavery. We'll talk about the concept of a society in which people have status or hierarchy. We'll explore the history of slavery through the world, and we'll talk about why American slavery was so unique compared to slavery before it. And we'll explore the fight for freedom that slaves through the ages have endured. When the program's done, hopefully you'll have a clear understanding of slavery and history, and many of your questions will be answered. Let's begin. Slavery, in one form or another, has existed for a long time. It's existed longer than written history in virtually all parts of the world. Slavery is a vague term, and it can mean many things, from the serf system of medieval Europe and the similar systems in Africa to the overwhelming and complete system in the South. Now, you may only be familiar with slavery in the southern United States, but slavery has existed the world over. Greece, Rome, Africa, India, China, parts of Europe, and the Muslim world are familiar with slavery from ancient days. Why did slavery exist? Why did people find it useful to enslave others? Basically, the reasons were economic and political. Slaves provided labor. Slaves provided a place to put your enemies if you conquered them in war. Slaves provided power for the winners of war, for the rich, and for the government. A slave has a different status than a free person. Generally, a slave is powerless. His power has been transferred to either another person, or a government, or a company. A slave cannot control his own life. A slave is usually considered property of one form or another. In the extreme, like in the American South, a slave was legally not a person. On the other extreme, some slaves were given great opportunity for advancement into medicine and education. And, upon freedom, some slaves even rose to be political leaders in their countries. To understand slavery, we have to understand the concept of human rights. The basic rights that you expect in America are not necessarily the rights your ancestors enjoyed. Every one of us has slavery in our ancient past. Every one of us. White, black, Asian, Hispanic, and Native American. Let's talk about rights. In America, we often take personal rights and liberties for granted. Freedom of speech, of religion, and so forth. There is constant discussion about rights in our society. Instead of taking them for granted, let's look at them closely. Here are some basic human rights which a totally free person can possess. 1. Freedom of movement. 2. Freedom to enjoy the benefits of working. 3. Freedom to marry and start a family. 4. Freedom of religious expression. 5. Freedom of belief and expression. A slave does not have access to some or all of these rights as part of their status. Imagine life without these basic freedoms. Imagine what it would be like to be enslaved. Now, one of the important points to make is that slavery was very different depending on where it existed and when. Most slaves were not as lacking in rights as the slaves in the American South. Most slaves in history had some rights, but all slaves lacked all the rights we take for granted in America. place to place on the globe throughout history. Slavery reached its greatest usage in societies in which lesser varieties of bondage no longer existed. Obviously, slaves were cheap labor. They drove economies. They facilitated growth. They allowed the basis for growth, power, and expansion. Most of the great civilizations, including Western civilizations, were built on the backs of slaves. Where did slaves come from? Throughout history, the biggest source by far was warfare. In some cases, war was declared for the purpose of acquiring slaves. Apart from warfare as a source of slaves, the offspring of slaves themselves was a major source of new slaves. How do you get someone to submit to slavery? Isn't being a slave against the human spirit? Well, in most cases, remember, slaves were not treated as harshly as they were here in the Americas by the Europeans. The basic way to assure submissiveness was to uproot the slave from his or her homeland, put them in a new environment, and isolate them as much as possible so they can't assimilate into the new culture. That's why, for instance, in ancient Rome, if you were a criminal and they sentenced you to slavery, they exported you to a foreign land. You were out of place, you probably didn't speak the language, and you could be controlled. Treat a slave okay and give him a few rights, something to hope for, and he'd probably stay with you instead of venturing out into a hostile foreign world. Get it? Now, there's a false impression that slavery was driven by prejudice. In fact, prejudice rose out of slavery. It was a result of slavery. It was not the cause. And throughout history, slavery was almost always for reasons other than prejudice. It was usually an issue of cheap, manageable labor. It was not started because of hatred. It's time to start thinking about this concept. It's time to realize why people in history have been enslaved. It's time to realize that prejudice was a result of slavery, not the cause in most cases. And it's time to recognize that slavery has been a part of civilization for a very long time. An important point to recognize is that there are two types of slave-owning societies. Genuine slave societies, like in the American South, and slave-owning societies like ancient Egypt. Classical Greece, Rome, the American South, and the Caribbean were genuine slave societies. Other societies were slave-owning societies. The ancient Near East, Egypt, India, and China. What's the difference? In slave-owning societies, slaves were given rights. They were often given the opportunity for advancement and prestige. For instance, slaves drawn from the Hellenized Syrians in Rome were often enslaved as educators and doctors. They were called elite slaves. Some other elite slaves, the Mamelukes, were purchased outside Islam, given military and religious training, and then released after they had served. In some African civilizations, freed slaves were even able to hold political office. So slavery has meant different things in different civilizations. The differences can be broken down as follows. Ownership. Who owned the slave? Was it a person, an institution, a government, or a religious deity? Rights. What rights did the slave have? Would they become free? Could they hold office? Were they considered citizens? Society. What were their roles in society? Responsibilities. What tasks did they perform? Let's focus on the history of slavery, and in particular, the history that led to slavery in the Americas. It's important to know that slavery existed in Europe since antiquity. For generations, Europeans enslaved one another. Venetian and Genoese slave traders brought Armenians, Bulgarians, Circassians, and Serbs from the Turks and sold them in Mediterranean countries. The practice was common. In fact, if you look at the names of Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, you'll discover the correlation in the use of the Slav part of the name itself. Slav equals slave. So it was predictable that the concept of slavery was brought on the first ships from Europe to the New World. Now, New World slavery was unique. It's sometimes assumed that slavery in Africa, Africans enslaving Africans, was the same as slavery in America. This is not true. In fact, Slavery in Africa was very similar to European feudalism. The feudal system was a system where landowners had power over the people using their land. The lord of the land could enlist his people to serve in arms for him, or to serve in his court. The serfs of the land weren't slaves, but they were ruled by the owners of the land upon which they lived and farmed. They had limited rights. They were subject to the will of their land's lord. This is called feudalism, and slavery in Africa was similar to this. Slavery in the New World was unique and on a completely different level. So how did slavery officially begin in the Americas? That's the point of the next part of this program. Who were the first slaves in America? They weren't black. They were, in fact, the native peoples of America. When Europeans began to conquer America, they quickly resorted to enslaving the people they conquered. Native Americans in North America were used on plantations and in mines, but their lack of resistance to any of the European viruses and the European diet made them vulnerable and weakened. In addition, the Native Americans' culture made it almost impossible to accept the fate of being a slave in their own native land. Both the Spanish and the English attempted slavery of the Native Americans. However, it did not work for very long. But the needs of a growing colonial society were great. Slave labor was the only way Europeans knew how to cope with the extraordinary task of carving a new society for themselves. So they quickly resorted to a second form of slavery, indentured servitude. If Native Americans were the first group of slaves in the Americas, who were the second? In a word, whites. All races and religions were available as slaves, but the vast majority of the second group were white Europeans. They came to North America under a variety of conditions, as criminals, as indentured servants, and as abducted men, women, and children. But they all shared a common lot of slavery when they arrived. Indentured servants, before they left their homeland, signed a contract. This contract said, if their voyage to America is paid for by the holder of the contract, then they will agree to serve them as servants for a certain amount of time. Another way to get here was by being a redemptioner. Redemptioners arranged with the captain of the ship to pay for passage upon their arrival in America, or for a short time thereafter. If they didn't, they would be sold as a slave to the highest bidder. That's a debt you'd be sure you could pay before you entered into the deal. Another source of slaves was convicts. European governments could rid themselves of pesky criminals by simply shipping them to America. Americans didn't necessarily like this idea. Ben Franklin complained that by shipping convicts here, the old world was dumping its outcast on the new. Another tragic source of slavery was abduction. All over London and Bristol, kidnapping of adults and children became very common and was a very serious problem. Labor agents began roaming Europe, enticing people to take their belongings and immigrate to America voluntarily. Of course, the agents would collect a handy commission on each one. It's safe to say that white slavery was a significant and important period in American history. Europeans were slaves for over 100 years here in America. Europe became concerned at the effects of this massive emigration of its people to the U.S. as slaves. National security in European countries came into question from the population drain. So slowly, the massive continent of Africa was looked at as a source of slave labor. Meanwhile, back in America, the condition and status of slaves grew worse and worse. At first, for many, slavery or servitude was still a voluntary contract for a definite period of time. But the status of them while they were servants became more and more like chattel. Chattel is a term used to describe a commodity, a thing that can be owned. Chattel is something less than human with no rights. The problem of escape became greater as the conditions of slavery grew more intolerable. And once a white person escaped, it was hard to identify him in the community. Africans, however, were distinct and easily identified. Therefore, Africans seemed to make better candidates from a practical standpoint than Europeans. Not because they were more suited for slavery, but because they were out of place here, and because they were easily identified. The problem was money. It was expensive to bring Africans across the ocean, and certainly it was much too far to the Far East or India to bring servants, who would be otherwise as equally identifiable and out of place here. That all changed with three simple words: tobacco, cotton, and sugar. It all came down to money. By the end of the 1500s, the Africans' fate in America was sealed. The price of sugar skyrocketed, and the demand for sugar from the Caribbean exploded. This was the justification for introducing many more slaves into America, and the source was now the continent of Africa. Back in the U.S., cotton and tobacco became established as chief cash crops in the South. The crops required hard labor for planting and harvesting, and that meant one thing: slave labor. Now, the system for slave labor was already firmly in place here in America. The white slaves had established it. The buying and transporting of human cargo had been going on for over 100 years. Africans fit perfectly into the equation. Unfortunately, by the time the Africans made it on the scene here, things for the American slave had already gotten really bad. In history, most societies did not go as far as America in eliminating all human ties to society, family, and rights as American slaves endured. The new American slaves, the Africans, lost all control over their lives. Their slavery extended to the next generation. In essence, there was no escape at all. Why did the Africans become slaves here? The reasons were economic, not racial. It didn't have to do with the African's color. In fact, slaves would have been drawn from any corner of the world to satisfy America's needs. The Africans had the unfortunate fate of being close to the east coast of America. For as long as there has been slavery, slaves have been fighting for freedom. In America, the fight for freedom began when the first slave boat arrived on American soil. Far from people who merely accepted their fate, the Africans would make life for their new owners very unpleasant and unproductive. They could work inefficiently. They could attempt to escape. They could turn against their master's property, cause damage, or otherwise sabotage them. But unfortunately for the African-American slave, there was nowhere to escape on this soil. Slaves did rebel in America from time to time, but they were never truly successful. The North had less slavery than the South, partially because the agricultural economy of the North was more diverse, and mass slave labor didn't make as much sense economically. So, many blacks from the Upper South tried to make their way north through the famous Underground Railroad. This was a network of free blacks and friendly whites who helped transport escaped slaves northward. The American Civil War ended it all, and with it, slavery seemed to diminish across the world. Now, we already said that slavery occurred for economic and political reasons, not racial ones. It's not surprising that the end of slavery came about for exactly the same reasons. The Civil War was not, at first, about slavery. Granted, there were loud cries of opposition to slavery in America, but the war was really about the federal government trying to keep the Union of States together. Lincoln decided that he could win a war quicker if he proclaimed freedom for the slaves, and slavery gradually became a call to arms against the southern states. Slavery must go because it was the cause of the war and provided strength for the South. Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. It freed slaves in any state in rebellion against the Union, and the chapter on world slavery began to close. Today, over 100 years later, the effects of the enslavement of blacks are still being felt in America. Civil rights issues are still being brought to bear. The prejudice that resulted from slavery is still being fought and understood in this country. But you, the viewer, can now realize that prejudice was a byproduct of slavery, not the cause. And you, the viewer, also realizes that slavery is not only a black issue. It's an issue that has affected everyone throughout history. Is the book on slavery closed? Unfortunately, no. Today, there are probably more than 500,000 slaves in the world, particularly in the Near East. On the Arabian Peninsula, chattel slavery still exists and is legal. People are still enduring the hardships, degradation, and lack of freedom that slaves throughout history have endured. It's your turn to do some thinking. Think about slavery in history. Confront your misunderstandings and assumptions about American slavery. Understand the source of prejudice. Look into the historic efforts behind the civil rights movement and the righting of wrongs committed during slavery, and find ways that you can help eliminate slavery in all its forms during your lifetime.